Before we get started, we want to acknowledge two events happening in our home state of California. We first want to begin by acknowledging the devastating wildfires and windstorms affecting LA County. Hearts go out to everyone affected. We understand that words of acknowledgement are insufficient when so many communities have lost so much. We recognize the immense challenges faced by residents, first responders, and all those working tirelessly to support recovery efforts. Andrea and I send our love, strength, and awareness to all individuals affected. If you are feeling a call to action in these moments, we invite you to text Red Cross to 90 to make a $10 donation and or visit redcross.org/donate to view the list of supplies needed for donations. If you are wanting to do some boots on the ground volunteer work, please check in with 7th Street Collective in the Long Beach area and or It's Bigger Than Us in the Crenshaw area for volunteer duties and shifts. These links will also be located in our bio and within our link tree.
Additionally, we are deeply concerned about the ongoing immigration raids happening in California, which many of you know is home to Jack and I. These immigration raids are targeting farm workers and other essential workers, many of whom are vital to our agricultural industry and local economies. These actions not only disrupt the lives of hardworking families, but also have far-reaching implications for the U.S. economy, because essential migrant workers play a crucial role in ensuring food security for the rest of the nation. We acknowledge the emotional and financial toll these raids will take on families and the uncertainty they face as a result. As these events continue to unfold, we encourage everyone to stay informed, educate themselves through credible sources, and watch the news for updates. We will also have a link to resources in our link tree. In moments like these, it is critical to understand the full scope of the issue and its impact on both individuals directly affected and communities that depend on their labor. These two events happening in California really show us that the terms like I do not watch the news or I don't keep up with current events because it is depressing or because it doesn't affect me are blissfully ignorant terms that stem out of privilege. As an intertwined global community, we cannot afford that privilege. We need more empathy and not more apathy. That is why our podcast, Ponle Acento, strives to be a conversational podcast derived from research and lived experience. And now we invite you to stay tuned for our Fight or Flight and Children of Immigrants episode coming up next. Hello, everyone. Welcome to your favorite podcast hosted by your favorite primas. I'm one of the primas. My name is Andrea, and I'm joined by my co-host and also prima.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jack, and you're listening to our podcast, Ponle Acento.
Welcome, everyone. So, Jack, have you ever heard the term, esa niña o ese niño es nervioso or nerviosa?
All the time. And even when we are now grown adults, we still listen to the stories of how they were once niños muy nerviosos or muy nerviosas.
Yeah, it's a real thing, right? It's a term that just comes again when people are telling their stories or whenever like more adult individuals, I say more adults because now we are adults too. But whenever we're like tios or tias or our abuelita, we'll just like look at that baby, at that child and say like, oh, está nerviosa, right? Like, dale un té de manzanilla or dale un té de, siete azares. It's all very interesting, right? That there's these like terms that I think now we kind of laugh about it, but it makes you think like, where do these terms actually stem from? Like, is there a larger reason why that is a very popular term? Is there a reason why we have so many deaths for every single thing that we can think of, which by the way, if you are in your late 20s or early 30s, don't forget to drink your turmeric tea. It's good for inflammation. So I'm just going to plug that in there. But yeah, it makes you think like, where does this stem from? So today's episode is about fight or flight in immigrant children. So fight or flight, that's a big one, right? And I think for a lot of us who maybe did not get a chance to fully understand biology in high school, this is a redemption, right? This is something that we'll be talking about today because I think that fight or flight and epigenetics is really can describe a lot of what children of immigrants feel. So let's begin
Mhm.
with a definition. What is fight or flight? So according to Simply Psychology, it is our body's natural physiological response or reaction to a stressful, frightening, or dangerous event. So this would often be when you are driving on the freeway, all of a sudden a car just like swerves right in front of you in your lane and you automatically step on that brake. That is your
Mhm.
fight or flight kicking in, right? It wants you to survive. And so part of that is raising up those cortisol hormones, those cortisol levels, which is our stress hormone, to let our bodies know you are in danger. So keep
Mhm.
your guard up because you are in danger. And I always say, Jack, that our bodies are the best communicators, right? They are the best
Mhm.
communicators. Our bodies tell us what they need and when we need it. And sometimes we're stubborn and we don't listen to our bodies, but really our bodies are telling us when we're in fight or flight. Very recently, I actually went to a counter strain appointment, which is, it's not a new practice. I know it's derived from Asian cultures, but it is where you do certain pressure points like in your head
Mhm.
and in
Mhm.
your feet to add blood flow to areas that are maybe hurting, right? And so my practitioner who was working on my counter strain session, she said, "You are stuck in fight or flight, Andrea." I was like, "How do you
Mhm.
know?" And she goes, "Well, because your body is asking for blood flow to your abdominal like chest area, right? So if you
Mhm.
think like from your shoulders down to like below your belly button, you need blood flow there." And I was like, "Huh, like how do you know that?" And she goes, "Well, whenever you are or anyone is in fight or
Mhm.
flight, the body, because it wants you to survive and it thinks you're about to fight something or run away from something, it
Mhm.
sends blood to your arms and legs because again, it thinks that you need to run away from something." And so oftentimes, and I know it's a little bit taboo and like embarrassing to say, right? But it's very true. Whenever we are stressed and we are having digestive issues, right, where we are
Mhm.
maybe feeling like constipated, um, that is a telltale sign that we are in
Mhm.
fight or flight, right? Because there's no blood flow in our abdominal area. Everything is to our arms and to our legs because our body's like ready to fight, ready to keep us alive.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
have you ever felt that way at all, Jack? Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it actually does. Most recently, as I mentioned, we're two primas, first generation college student, Latinas. And so most recently, I think an event where I was genuinely, my body was about to give up on me was while I was in New York doing my graduate program. Not only am I a woman of color, but I was also the only woman of color in my program, the only Latina, the only first generation low income Latina in the program. And so I constantly went through so many microaggressions, not only with, higher level up staff, professors, but even within my own like cohort at times. It was a very sad moment for me. And in those moments, I had to realize like that my position, oftentimes would leave me without the ability for me to correct them because how was I going to talk back to my professors in that matter? And unfortunately, these relationships really do matter, especially given that I want to be someone who wants to go into academia. I want to become a professor. And so these relationships can really affect me. And so there was a time where, I was getting all of these comments made and I would call my mom. I would be crying. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to ruin my position there. I had all these other opportunities and, I didn't want them to get a call from my professor saying like I wouldn't work with her. And so I really had to, in that case, like instead of fighting, I would have to leave the situation. And there was a point that came that was really significant for me where I had to go get, medical help because my food was no longer being digested. I couldn't even hold my food anymore. I was always laying on my mat in my apartment alone, just like wasn't feeling really good. And I thought, well, my throat doesn't hurt, like my head doesn't hurt, but why can't I eat? I tried my best. I would even get food that I really liked over there, my favorite restaurant, and nothing was helping. And it wasn't until my mom said, you should probably get out of that situation. It doesn't seem like it's doing you any good. And that's part of, I think, fight or flight is just choosing our battles at times too, and prioritizing our mental health and our physical health. Because, like you said, our body knows. And that was a time where it just clicked on me. I'm like, my body has never, never, not even in undergrad, when, again, I was also depressed. I had just left home. I was very homesick, but I was very excited for this new journey. Even then, I've had found ways for me to leave that like depression behind and just go distract myself for a bit. And now all of a sudden, my body was giving up on me and I didn't know what to do. And so this response of flight often left me just going back and forth, rethinking whether or not I could have spoken up. But being first generation, I think oftentimes we overthink these conflicting feelings and we don't know where they stem from or why we're feeling so bad. And we waste so much time of that when we live our imposter syndrome in those moments, because we oftentimes, I think I would just blame it on that, be like, it's just my imposter syndrome. It's fine. It's fine. Like, I've done this before. It's fine. But then I think in that moment, it really was fight or flight. And in this case, I just prioritized myself. I realized that it wasn't really serving me. And so I took that initiative and I prioritized my physical well-being.
Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate your vulnerability. I think that when we are the first ones, children of immigrants and first gen in any place, whether it's in a formal education institution or whether it is, if you are a barber or an electrician or a plumber, right? There are still those feelings of fight or flight that come across. And I often think like being a child of immigrants comes with so much honor, but also with so much pressure. And I think about how many times we will like hold on and stay in fight or flight because we don't want to disappoint. We think about like, well, my parents didn't come here and sacrifice their language, their community, their everything that they knew for me to be mediocre, right? And so how many times as children of immigrants do we just hang on there when our body's like, this is it, Andrea, like you need to get out of it, right? And it's important for us to also recognize that whenever we are in fight or flight and, we don't want to disappoint, maybe we have a conversation with the people that we love and with the people that continuously support us, because maybe that is something that's just in our brain, right? Like if I leave, I'm going to disappoint my mom, or I'm going to disappoint my dad or my sister, right? But maybe they will absolutely understand what it was like, right? Or maybe they want that well-being for you, that like everything else does not matter. So those are important conversations to have. And so I celebrate you, Jack, for having that conversation with your mom and saying like, hey, I know that you are so proud of me. I know that it was so much hard work to get to where I am today, but I really cannot do it. And, courage is, to continue going, but courage is also knowing when to stop. And that's super important. And so as we navigate fight or flight in ourselves as children of immigrants, it's important for us to also remember the fight or flight that was really navigated through our own parents, through the immigrants themselves, right? And so when we think about how did our parents or how did our family members experience fight or flight, right? Because oftentimes there are our rock. They know what remedio, they know what to do, what to say, but understanding that they too felt these feelings of fear. And a lot of that is immigration status uncertainty, even for mixed status families, right? Whenever a few siblings have, documented status, whether and others don't, right? So there's that uncertainty of like, what's going to happen with my siblings? And then that person who is undocumented may be thinking like, what is going to happen if, immigration comes? Like, what's going to happen with my kids, right? This is a world that they have created, and the world that they left behind is no longer one that maybe they know or they remember because they built their life here. Economic struggles, right? So trying to think of how they were going to put bread on the table, and oftentimes understanding that when they left their country of origin, maybe they were engaged in different work than they were here when they came to the US. There have been so many examples of individuals particularly for me, when I worked at a nonprofit doing immigration legal work, there were so many individuals that were coming from the um, Middle East, and they had, they were doctors and they were professors. And as soon as they came to the US, like they had to start at another stage of their life. A lot of them ended up being like Uber drivers while they got back on their
Mhm.
feet because their formal education from their country of origin was no longer accepted here in this country. Cultural adaptation. So fight or flight when you have to now adapt to this whole new language. And so
Mhm.
I celebrate the resilience and the bravery that our parents, the immigrants themselves, have chosen to come into a country really from scratch
Mhm.
and learn how to navigate this, and especially for their children. So that
Mhm.
can be, one way in which we experience that fight or flight. As I was reading, kind of doing the research for this episode, Jack, I actually was reminded from something that happened this past summer. My sister, who was very young, she ended up going into cardiac arrest during gallbladder surgery. And I thank you for being
Mhm.
so supportive during that time. I remember that the moment that we were going through the process of getting her into the hospital, she was airlifted into a local hospital, and her heart was only working 5% on her right side. We began, the whole family was there. We filled up the waiting room and everything. And I
Mhm.
just remember my body like clicked into like numbness. Like
Mhm.
everyone around me was crying and panicking because my sister was practically on her deathbed, and she had postpartum
Mhm.
cardiomyopathy, which that alone can be a separate issue on its own. And how oftentimes people of color, women of color, slip through the cracks in the medical
Mhm.
field. But, that could be another conversation. I was just like frozen the entire time. And it was almost
Mhm.
like I was being very transactional, right? I was asking questions, I was saying yes, and I was saying no. And everything just felt like it was in a movie, right? A out of body experience. But I remember a moment where I was like, I am definitely in fight or flight
Mhm.
when the doctor, the cardiologist, came in and had a conversation with me and my parents, and I had to translate for my parents. And at this point, they had put up a small pump in my sister's heart because she was not going to make it if there was no heart activity in the next 72 hours. So I remember the doctor saying the pump is doing all the work. Her heart is nothing. Like there's nothing coming out of her heart. And then my mom turned around and, my mom, her English is something that she's
Mhm.
worked on. But, when you're in that situation and you're translating
Mhm.
medical terms, it's just so much more different. So I just remember my mom and my dad turning around to look at me and said, ¿Qué dijo, mija? And I was
Mhm.
like, holy smokes. How do I
Mhm.
tell my parents your daughter is dying? Her heart is not working. Um,
Mhm.
and so again, like our bodies will do what they need to do. I remember like tingling in my feet, tingling in the ends of my fingers because, I think that as children of immigrants, when we're put in situations where we need to mature quickly or translate not so easy conversations, like that's so difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Very difficult situation. And it's very hard again to be a child of immigrants where we have these moments in life where we have to communicate with our family members. And it's almost like we come second in those moments.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And although, again, it's a privilege for us to be able to have the skill set at the same time, comes with a lot of hardship. And so I often think too about our parents, how they immigrated into a country, right? Because they wanted more economic stability and they wanted to be safe from whatever danger was in their home country. But then they come to a country and the country is actually not very welcoming. I remember starting at UCLA, and when I first started in my major, I was very excited because, it was about my community, the Chicanos and Central Americans. And I really wanted to learn more about Central Americans given that our family is Mexican. So I wanted to be inclusive. And then I come to find that There's so many laws back then in California. We often think California is very progressive, but when they first came here, there was so many ads that were very xenophobic, and they wanted to deport these people. And now we look at the present times and it's happening all over again. And so we're constantly in fight or flight. And even in the moments where we're calm, we don't know when we're going to face a discrimination from someone, right? Especially with the election that occurred. There's more of that happening nowadays. As I mentioned, I went through so many microaggressions, and so we're constantly in this fight or flight. And being a child of immigrants, it's oftentimes, we're relied on a lot. So I think at times too, we should give ourselves that grace. And also, I worked on this boundary of like when I need time to just think or I need my space, I am a bit more vocal about it. I could definitely work on it more. But yeah, I think that's one of the resources that we could use of setting boundaries and just having that grace for ourselves.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you, Jenna. One of golden rule that I used in my 20s as I was learning how to figure out boundaries was Brene Brown's quote, clear as kind, right? If I am clear to what is happening or to give instructions and I'm being kind to myself because I am kind of stating my expectations, but I'm also being kind to the other individual or individuals because now they know what to expect from me. So I definitely champion the advocating for yourself and having that conversation. And not always easy, but it needs to happen because if not, we are going to be stuck in that fight or flight. And so moving on to like what does fight or flight, like what does this mean? Like how does this relate to being a child of immigrants? And so I'm going to go and quote now a psychologist by the name of Gabor Mate, who stated, fear not dealt with gets ingrained as anxiety, right? So when we are so stuck in that fight or flight for so long, when our parents are stuck in fight or flight for so long, it just now becomes anxiety. And so now we have a whole generation of individuals, first gen and even now second generation, who have high functioning anxiety and high functioning depression. And so when you think about, okay, if our parents had anxiety, but maybe they didn't even know that that's what it was, right? Maybe they just said, son nervios, right? And they had their telemanzanilla or the siete sales, right? But when you think about it, our parents did not have maybe the resources, the knowledge, or even the acceptance by society to have that conversation, right? Because if you talk about, oh, I feel nervous or I feel anxious, almost like, what do you mean? Like, this is what we need to do. We need to go to work. And so I often think that anxiety was their new normal and it was masqueraded as hard work and dedication. And so our parents, they never reached homeostasis in their body. It just became their normal. And so what happens when those parents are holding so much anxiety and so much stress? How do we know, how do we make sure that we kind of end that cycle? Well, it didn't really end with our parents, right? We continue to feel it today because I'm going to introduce a topic that is currently continuously being studied in biology, and that is known as epigenetics. So this is a branch of biology that, according to the National Library of Medicine, is a study of how cells control gene activity without changing DNA. So again, thinking about fight or flight, we have parents that are consistently in fight or flight, right? It just becomes their normal. So then what happens? They have their offspring, and because they have lived their whole life in fight or flight with high cortisol levels, which again, a reminder, that is our stress hormone. What ends up happening is that there are epigenetic changes. These are modifications in our DNA that regulate which genes are turned on and off. So one example could be that because our parents had a lot of cortisol, high cortisol levels, because that is what they needed to survive, as they have their families of their own and their offsprings, they are too activating the genes of high cortisol because now they have been told, our bodies have communicated, well, you know what? Parents, so we'll use my parents as an example. You know what, Ana and Leonel, you all were very stressed, whether they recognized it or not. You had so much anxiety, again, whether they recognized it or not, that in order for Andrea to survive, right, survival of the fittest, we are going to turn on the methyl group, which is a process known DNA methylation. We are going to turn on the methyl group to the DNA molecule that is going to activate the gene of high cortisol. Because if you needed it to survive, so does Andrea, right? And so what ends up happening is that now what was just supposed to be an experience that our parents went through, which was very traumatic, now they have passed that gene down to us as well. So studies have shown us through, multiple studies, including studies done on mice, that there is that then those DNA modifications follow us for up to 2, even 3 generations afterwards. So even though we are not the ones who experience the physical immigrating from one country to another, we didn't experience crossing the desert or the Rio Grande, right? We still have the genes. We still carry with us the cortisol levels that were needed to be activated on those parents in order for them to survive. Does that make sense? Does that feel like something that could maybe describe why children of immigrants are often functioning on high anxiety and high depression?
I think so. It would make sense because we oftentimes, again, see our parents, whether they acknowledge it or not, in a very like anxiety driven state where, they're just really tight or really tired all the time. I think in our generation, or within our culture, I should say, anxiety comes through the door and we try to be vocal about it and we're just giving a tea. Or we're told, no, just like, you just have to go and like, tienes que ir a barrer or just, do chores and it's fine. So yeah, I think that would make perfect sense because our family certainly never had these conversations despite our parents, both of our parents are on the middle older end, I would say. And I know my mom certainly being one of 4 women, within 13 kids, 11. She always mentions how, she would not only go with her male siblings to work, but then she came home and all the responsibility of cooking or like washing the dishes was all on her. And so she often talks about that anxiety. And then sometimes I'll see my mom in the kitchen and she's rearranging everything. I'm like, whoa, you work today? Like, you should probably rest. It's okay. I can do it for you. No. Like, I just like it a certain way. It takes control of that. But I think that also, one could say it's her anxiety where she's just so used to it. And now, she's stressed out and she goes into that mode of, I need to do something. And I feel like oftentimes I'm in the same position where I'm barely stressed out and I have all these like stress balls that I'm not going to show, but I have all these things because I constantly have to be moving my hands. Even now I have something right now in my hand where, I'm talking, but I'm moving my hands because I'm just like, it's just so something that has always been with me where if I'm not doing something, I feel like I'm not being productive. Anxiety right away. I feel like I need to do something. So I feel like it would make sense that, our parents grew up in this and that same body reaction is then given to us.
Right.
Yeah, I think that could be a possible reason why.
Yeah. We have our body that is doing like everything that it possibly can to keep us alive and keep us in homeostasis. And we just don't listen to it sometimes. And so it's super important to be able to take care of ourselves and maybe teach our parents to take care of their body. Yes, they have been in fight or flight for so long, so much that, they had epigenetic changes happen to them and given to us, but that doesn't have to be the norm, right? We can initiate a new generation or teach younger generations to be able to navigate those conversations because this is a chain and we can break chains, right? And so it'll be very interesting to see what studies come out of epigenetics. It's still pretty new, right? It's not determined whether it's causation. It's just definitely very heavily correlated. And one of the reasons of why it still remains as a correlation and not causation is because when scientists are looking to kind of investigate, do research on epigenetics, it would be really inhumane to study humans, right? Having them go through like, a stage of famine or a stage of war, and then having them reproduce so that they can see what changes happen to their genes, right? And so that is why we're kind of like at a slow progression with epigenetics, but we have seen those studies been done like in mice, for example, where again, we see that those cortisol levels of mice pups who were separated from their mom then pass down those cortisol high levels to their offspring, right? And so definitely something to understand, to keep an eye out for, and maybe even in some cases a way for us to validate what we feel. Like there is a scientific explanation behind it, right? There is, if you're having tension in your shoulders or, struggling with constipation or any other digestion, there's an explanation for it. And I think that oftentimes we can begin our healing by validation. And so if you are a listener today and you need that validation, we are here to give that to you, and know that you are not the only one. And I don't say that to minimize anyone's struggle, right? I just want you to know that you are not an individual who is feeling those feelings on your own and you should be ashamed of at all. Like, I want you to know we too, right? Jack, you also feel those feelings too, because that just opens up the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that part of this too, very beautiful thing that I'm seeing within our generation is the fact that entre primas,
Yes.
and with our primos, it's mostly females right now, but within the cousins, I should say, we are having these conversations. And I think that's a beautiful way to start it so that we can support one another. And then ideally, start these conversations with our parents. And it's really interesting because at times too, I would call my mom and I'd be like, what are you doing? She'd be like, being lazy just in the sofa. And I would always have to correct her, be like, even though, laziness sometimes is actually a really good thing to rest the body. But at this point, I would tell my mom, well, laziness, or are you resting? Because you have a really long day at work. My mom, is a fighter. She works 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, sometimes 6 days a week. And so I would always have to remind her to, again, give herself that grace. It's okay for our bodies to rest. And so, again, having these like little micro conversations with her, not necessarily being like, maybe you need to calm down so that you don't have all this anxiety on you. I'd be like, well, mom, it's okay. Like, if anything, I put on a movie for her or ask her if she wants me to make her a coffee. And I try to help in those ways too, where I also try to just pamper my mom at times. I think that's also part of it. And it's also really healing for me to give back to her in these small little ways of, doing things for her. And so, yeah, I think these conversations are really important. And I'm really glad that this is one of our first episodes where we're addressing this because it's an ongoing thing. And so I think, again, these conversations are important. And just thank you to the primos for listening, the primas, and also our friends. I think our friends go through it a lot too. And it's really, really a happy thing when we have these friendships that understand and where we create the safe space to talk about it.
I love that. And I'm like thinking, like, should we call our listeners las primas y los primos? Because we're one whole big family here. So we can join them, right?
Yeah, that's amazing. I hope they're okay with it. And yeah, let's create this big family.
I love it. All right, everyone. If you are listening, you have been formally adopted as our prima or primo. So welcome to the family. And just like that, we are wrapping up our first official episode on fight or flight and epigenetics. So Jack, if our listeners want to follow us on social media or send us an email, where can they do that?
Of course. So we encourage everybody to go follow our Instagram page. It's Ponle Acento Podcast all together. And our DMs are open. Please feel free to send us any feedback, any suggestions, any ideas of what you would like us to address in the podcast. We also have a Gmail that is ponleacento.podcast@gmail.com. And you can reach us at an Instagram, or again, you can email us at ponleacento.podcast@gmail.com. And we hope, you take these two modes of communication and please reach out to us. You may think it's a small little idea, but I guarantee you a lot of people have been sharing what they want to hear, and it's all interconnected, and it's also often the same responses. So please feel free to reach out to us. And again, follow us on Instagram on Ponle Acento Podcast.
Right on. And for our final remarks, we remind you that this podcast is brought to you by Andrea and Jack. It is co-hosted, co-produced, and co-directed by both primas, Andrea and Jack. Editing the recorded content is done by me, Andrea. Social media and outreach is done by Jack. Research on discussed topics is done by both primas, and sources can be found on our link tree. We aim to make our platform nonpartisan. In the case of an opinion being expressed by either, those opinions belong solely to the person who expressed that opinion. For accessibility features on the podcast, please visit our YouTube channel for captions and script of the episodes. And let's wrap it up. Prima, what is your palabra de sabiduría for the week?
So, as I mentioned, we grew up in a Mexican household with my mother. So, telenovelas for me have been really impactful. So, I thought I'd share this time one of my favorite quotes from my favorite actress, Angelique Boyer. Her role as Teresa. And it's, entre ser y no ser, yo soy. So, essentially, I am. And this has carried me throughout, again, my educational experiences, always reminding myself that I am. I think it's very powerful to remind yourself of the power you have. And as I mentioned, or we mentioned in the podcast, we often go fight or flight. But at the end of the day, sometimes we do have to take these initiatives of leaving. But that does not mean that we are weak or that we're failures. If anything, it shows that we are powerful, we are worthy. And so, yeah, entre ser y no ser, yo soy. So always remind yourself of that.
Love it. And mic drop. For me, I'll share one of the kind of like the phrases that I always like to tell myself, especially when I'm going into work, is, did you hug someone with your words today? But I'm going to take it a little bit further. And I know that right now we are, if you're from California, you're experiencing a lot of maybe different feelings and thoughts and fears. So I'm going to take it a step further. And instead of saying, did you hug someone with your words today? I'm going to say, did your actions hug someone today? I think that when we are living in a very intertwined global community, whether we want to accept it or not, what we say has an impact, but what we do has a bigger impact. And so as a community, how we help individuals out really says so much about who we are. And it really is something that in our culture we have learned to help others. And that means, doing research and selecting what to post on social media, selecting what businesses to support. All of that is very important. So my palabras de sabiduría are, did your actions hug someone today? And just like that, primos and primas, we are all done. Our next episode will air on Sunday, January 26th at noon. And we hope you will join us for that episode as well. Jack, finish it off.
Love, ANJ.
Bye, everyone.